well said. Well, we've seen in the past few weeks just how much of a threat terrorism and radical Islamic extremism is to Australia. The stabbing attack on Bishop Murray Emanuel at Wakeley by an allegedly radicalised teen who muttered about the Prophet in the wake of the attack. There was the knife attack on the weekend in Perth, where the teenager pledged jihad in text messages and had been in a de-radicalisation program for 2 years. There was also the alleged youth terror cell uncovered by police, where teenagers allegedly wanted to hunt down Jews and enemies of Allah. And ASIO boss Mike Burgess said in his major annual threat assessment that out of all the domestic threats, radical extremism is his #1 concern.
Sunni violent extremism poses the greatest religiously motivated extremist threat in Australia. ASIO remains concerned, though, about lone actors, the potential for an individual or small group under the radar of authorities to use readily available weapons to carry out an act of terrorism.
Well, given Islamic extremism is ASIO's top concern, we need to know what's driving young Australians to become radicalised. Is it social media and the internet? Is it propaganda coming from terror groups like Hamas, ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Or is it the seemingly protected hate preachers?
To the invading Jews we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. The trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, "O Muslim, O believer, there is a Yahudi behind me, come and kill him."
It's important to know why this radicalisation is happening, especially to our young Australians. And obviously, there should be a formal inquiry into all of this. Yet the Albanese government is holding an inquiry into, wait for it, right-wing extremist movements in Australia. They've deliberately excluded Islamic extremism and terrorism. They're only looking at right-wing extremism. The Senate inquiry is receiving submissions right now, and its first public hearing will be held in June. And have a look who one of the new members of this committee is. Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi, who, as you know, is suing Pauline Hanson for racial discrimination and who posed in front of this sign saying Jews should get in the bin. It was a social media post that she later deleted. Now, Liberal Senator James McGrath, who'll be on my show tonight, well, he tried to expand the inquiry to include all forms of extremism, not just right-wing extremism. He did this in December. Now, his amendment would have deleted the term right-wing extremist movements in Australia, and he would have replaced it with ideologically motivated and religiously motivated violent extremism, encompassing all forms. But the Albanese government didn't want to know about it. First, Labor tried to block him from even taking this to a vote, and then they voted no. They even tried to stop Senator McGrath from giving a 1-minute speech in the Senate on this topic. He eventually was given leave to make his statement, where he said this.
It is neither helpful nor accurate to reflexively assign these individuals to a place on the political spectrum. As such, having a sole focus on right-wing extremism foregoes considerations of the broader reality that violent extremism in general is the true threat to our society, specifically the horrific anti-Semitism that we've seen in recent weeks.
So despite ASIO warning that religious Islamic extremism is the top threat facing Australians, the Albanese government doesn't want to have an inquiry into this issue. It doesn't want to know why more teens are becoming potentially radicalised by Islamic terror. Labor only wants to focus on right-wing extremism. It's extraordinary and shocking that Labor would put politics ahead of the safety of Australians in such a blatant way. There's nothing more important than protecting our children, our families from extremists and terrorists. Yet for Labor, Their political agendas, apparently, are more important. The marginal seats they want to win in Western Sydney and Melbourne are apparently more important. All extremism is evil, threatening and dangerous, but the Albanese government deciding to exclude one form of extremism from scrutiny is an ugly reflection of its current lack of principles, its double standards and its disregard for the safety and security of all Australians. And Senator James McGrath will join me live tonight, and he's going to reveal what unfolded behind the scenes with both Labor and the Greens when he tried to include religious extremism in the Senate inquiry. Also tonight, Harvard's president breaks his silence, threatening to shut down the pro-Palestinian encampment and suspend any students who stay on campus. So what is it going to take for Australian chancellors and vice-chancellors to step up, show some courage and do the same? Also, the Prime Minister caught out after falsely claiming his ministers would speak to Beijing about the intimidating near collision with a Chinese fighter jet. Now, let's bring in tonight's panel. Let's start with Perth Mayor Basil Zemplis. Basil, look, it doesn't make sense to only examine one threat, one form of extremism that faces Australia, particularly when ASIO has made it clear, both publicly and you'd presume in behind the scenes confidential briefings to Labor as well, that the top threat is religiously motivated extremism.
No, it doesn't make sense, and I would have thought that we would want our body that is there to keep us safe, backed up by strong support from the federal government. We would want them checking every possible area of concern, be it from the left or be it from the right. We're well aware of what's happened in Perth recently over the weekend, a 16-year-old who was radicalised online. That's taken place, we think, because of interaction that he was able to have on the internet. That in itself is a can of worms that somehow needs to be brought under control. It's almost impossible to know how to do that, but we understand that that's what's happened in this case. So absolutely. I mean, if there are threats, if there is danger, if there is any terror that we need to be notified about or be concerned with, it shouldn't matter to us where it's coming from.
Exactly.
We should know that our authorities are on it and are telling us about it. That's what we want. That's what we expect.
Exactly. OK, let's bring in now as well former Victorian Liberal Party President Michael Kroger. Michael, good to see you. Look,
Sharri.
Exactly right. It doesn't matter whether this form of extremism is from the far left or the far right. Both are dangerous. The fact that Labor and the Greens have got together here to shut down this amendment from Senator McGrath is outrageous.
Well, it's a bit of a joke, isn't it? I mean, are we seeing an outbreak of right-wing extremism in this country in recent weeks? I don't think so. The problem we've got is these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, in some ways, some people, demonstrations on university campuses, inciting hatred against Jews all over the country. And where are the senior bureaucrats? I mean, for example, where's my friend Julie Bishop? Julie is the Chancellor of the ANU. Where is David Gonski, who's the Chancellor of UNSW? Why haven't they said something? I mean, a lot of these leaders hide behind their bodies, the Chancellor's organisation and the Vice Chancellor's organisation. But I would have expected Julie and Mr Gonski to speak out. These are two eminent Australians, one with a political background, one with a business background. They've got influence in the community, and it's regrettable that they haven't spoken out, because this is the problem in Australia today. These demonstrations which are inciting hatred against Jews. And it's a disgrace. And, this has all happened on Albo's watch. Mm-hmm. And this is something it looks as if Sharri, as you know, in the documentary he's done with Josh Frydenberg, that he's going to say a few things, but gee, he's been weak so far. He's been weak. Unlike Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, who, as we know, has been very good.
Yeah. Well, as Josh Frydenberg said when he was on the show a couple of nights ago, we have seen no leadership or weak leadership from across the board, from the university leadership, the chancellors, vice chancellors, and the political spectrum as well. And we need to see that leadership. Now, let's have a look at another big story today. The driver responsible for the Hunter Valley bus crash last year has pleaded guilty to killing 10 people and injuring 25 others, but in exchange for 10 counts of manslaughter being dropped. Basil, this is understandably making the victims' families furious. And according to the media reports today, and I think this was broken on Channel 7 originally, they've been begging the DPP to reconsider this deal.
There are no winners in a story like this, obviously. Whatever happens with custodial sentencing, it doesn't bring back those lives, which is so sad. But I do think it goes to a greater discussion, if you like, in our community, and that is the sort of custodial sentences that our courts are applying and whether they meet community expectations and standards. And this arrangement, if you like, an arrangement of convenience, if in some way, shape or form it helps get an outcome without having to do a greater body of work. And it seems almost uncaring talking about it in that manner when we're talking about the absolute fatalities that occurred in this case. But I'm not sure that it sits comfortably with most Australians. If somebody commits an offence that has a result, they should get the full force of the law imposed on them for that. And I don't think this sits comfortably with most Australians.
I agree. I think if you've got a case where, the police need to cut a deal to find someone's body or to get an admission, then you might be able to
Different
understand.
Story.
Exactly. But in this case, there's no question about who was driving the bus. This was a devastating loss of life. They were young lives, Michael, celebrating a wedding. You can understand the community outrage. And that's before the report in the Sydney Morning Herald today that the driver was addicted to opioids, according to the Herald, and was actually affected by them at the time of the crash. Michael Kroger.
Well, I think Basil's right in terms of community expectations. I'm not sure they've been met on this occasion, Sharri. He seems to me to be very fortunate given the absolute human carnage for which he was responsible, the lives that will never be recovered, the lives that will never be lived, and the parents of those people that were killed in this event, this accident. Our heart goes out to them. I mean, their lives will never be the same, and I think it's fair to say the DPP may have exercised too much caution on this occasion in relation to this defendant.
Yeah, completely. And the line in the media report I read about now for those families moving from grief back to anger. I mean, they just shouldn't have to go through this. Now, a new poll today, Australians are apparently not convinced by the Albanese government's renewable energy plan. This poll showing that only 40% believed Labor's 43% emissions reduction by 2030, just 6 years' time, would be achieved. Only 37% of Australians think that we are going to reach net zero by 2050. Basil, meantime, also support for nuclear lifted to 40%. This is now shaping up as a key election battleground issue as well, this nuclear.
I think what this tells us, what this polling tells us is, and just in case there's any Australian politicians who haven't quite cottoned on to this as yet, the Australian public are not mugs. Yes, they're very busy getting on with their lives, trying to negotiate the cost of living crisis and all of the current difficulties in Australian life that they have. But they're not mugs. We're living, walking, breathing in this country. And so we're well aware of where things are at in this pursuit of net zero. And so those targets, which, as you've outlined, not that far away in the case of 2036, etc., are we getting closer? Are we likely to meet them? The Australian public are saying, no, we can't see it at the moment. Now, either the Albanese government's not doing a good enough job selling it, or the Australian public are making up their own minds and going, look, right now from where we sit, we don't see it. We're either going to have to move faster, you're going to have to do things differently, or we're going to have to go down a different direction. And if nuclear is part of that answer, well, it makes sense and it is certainly understandable why that number is on the rise.
Michael, the cost of living crisis plays into this as well, of course. You know, people are just struggling to make ends meet. We heard just how tough it is from the RBA governor yesterday when she said that people are even cancelling their medical appointments. So it's perhaps understandable that, you know, this isn't a priority for many families.
Look, what it shows me is this, Sharri. It's a very important poll. What it shows me is this. People are losing confidence in Albo personally. They're losing confidence in the government. They basically think the government overreached with so many promises, and they're basically losing control of the country. They don't think they can reach their renewable energy targets. They don't think they're to be believed on immigration, which they said they would cut very significantly. Albo promised that the cost of living crisis would be fixed by him, which he can't do. He promised energy relief of $275. He promised to effectively keep interest rates under control, which he's failed to do. He promised to keep the borders safe, which he's failed to do. That he was a national security leader, no difference between him and the Liberal Party. Well, we've seen what's happened with 153 people released from detention. He promised sort of social cohesion under Labor. We've seen the outbreak of anti-Semitism, the worst we've seen in my lifetime, etc., etc. He's overreached and made so many promises. People basically now think this bloke can't be believed on anything. And he might have good intentions, but he's just not up to the job. And then what do we see him doing? Giving $1 billion to compete with the Chinese on making solar panels, $1 billion to quantum computing company, which is based in the US. People think he's got his priorities wrong. And I don't think Jim Chalmers is a star performer. So I think the fortunes of the government are continuing to decline. And as I've said many times, I don't think there's any hope that he'll have a majority government come the next election.
Well, you mentioned that you don't think he's going to have a majority government. Well, Basil, WA was a big reason why Albanese won in 2022. You know, the Liberal Party did so badly there. The retirement of a couple of very well-known and senior former ministers. Do you get the sense that WA will support Labor in the same way at the next election? You know, and I know you've got the Prime Minister coming to Perth tomorrow.
In town today, in fact, Sharri, spoke at a breakfast this morning, made some commitments around funding a mineral exploration map over 10 years for $566 million. So add another $500 million to that running tally. No, as it stands right now, Michael's list, an appropriate one, and in that list is safety. And right now, the grandmother, the incident at school, or rather the young school child who's no longer with us over the weekend, right now, Western Australians aren't even sure, particularly around those detainees, that the government, the federal government, are doing everything that they can to keep Australians safe. So he knows it. He keeps visiting Western Australia. He knows how important Western Australia is. Obviously, I'm a candidate for the Liberals at the next state election here, so there'll be a bias from me. But reading it as somebody who's been in the media for 30 years, it's not the same glow Labor's way as it was in the lead up to the last election. That is absolutely for sure and certain.
Well, you'll be pleased to know, Basil, seeing as there is speculation that you'll end up as Premier one day, that Roger Cook's polls are plummeting as well. I'm not going to put you on the spot about that now. Now, after months of speculation, today we learned that Bruce Lerman didn't have anyone lined up, so no third party lined up to pay his legal costs if he lost that defamation case against Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson, as he did. He ended up losing. According to the documents revealed in court today, his legal team agreed not to charge him if they lost. So this means now his lawyers are not going to get paid. Michael, and this might be a perspective just from me as a journalist working for a media company, but do you think people should be able to sue media companies if they have no chance of being able to pay the company's costs if they lose and the media company wins?
It's a very good question, and security for cost applications are hard to get against individuals, so that's why he's able to do this. The answer is no, I don't think they should. And this is more relevant in relation to all of the campaigns and legal actions against mining companies, farming organisations, but particularly mining companies, where the Environmental Defendants Offices are funded, and some of these, hard left groups take actions against mining companies, keep them in the courts for years, and if they lose the case, they don't have any funds to pay the pay the cost. So, you know, the courts are not there to satisfy everyone's grievance, particularly, you know, if you're impoverished or not. So, you know, is there a situation where security for cost applications should be made against, orders should be made against individuals? Probably, because this is a situation where, without commenting on the merits of the case, you know, Channel 10 are up for a huge bill, and the plaintiff seems to be impecunious.
Now, final word from you, Basil, on Donald Trump. We saw extraordinary evidence today from porn star Stormy Daniels. She gave quite an R-rated explicit version of her one-night stand with former President Donald Trump. Here was Trump addressing the media outside court.
This was a very big day, a very revealing day. As you see, their case is totally falling apart. They have nothing on books and records. It's just a disaster for the DA, for the Soros-backed DA. It's a disaster. I should be out campaigning right now.
So, Basil, Trump, they're saying he should be out campaigning now. Many are saying that this case in itself, the timing of it, is election interference. What do you think?
It may well be. I think what we've come to know from Donald Trump is doesn't matter what the question is, doesn't matter what the proposition is, Donald Trump is going to be Donald Trump. And it would seem from a distance that a vast majority of the American population go, that's OK, we're happy with that bloke. He's the one that we want to get in behind. Not sure if he's going to win the next presidential election, but he's going to go pretty close. And that in itself, it almost makes the mind boggle, doesn't it? Donald Trump doesn't mind being the target. I think it suits him. It suits his narrative. Doesn't matter what gets said about him. He bats it away and gets on with it. And that in itself is revealing in so many different ways.
All right, Basil Zemplis, Michael Kroger, great to see you both tonight. Now, coming up, James McGrath joins me to speak about what unfolded behind the scenes with Labor and the Greens when he tried to expand the inquiry from right-wing extremism, plus Liberal MP Julian Leeser on why he thinks there needs to be a judicial inquiry into university campuses. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, Harvard's interim president, Alan Garber, has threatened to suspend students who continue to occupy the Harvard Yard in that pro-Palestinian encampment. He said in an email, "I write today with this simple message. The continuation of the encampment presents a significant risk to the educational environment of the university. Those who participate in or perpetuate its continuation will be referred for involuntary leave from their schools." He says that, among other implications, students placed on involuntary leave may not be able to sit for exams or continue to reside in Harvard housing and must cease to be present on campus until reinstated. He says the encampment favours the voices of a few over the rights of many who've experienced disruption in how they learn and work at a critical time of the semester. Meanwhile, protests are still erupting on Australian campuses. Staff at La Trobe University have been told not to intervene with protesters when they disrupt classrooms and to let them share the information they wish to for a full 5 minutes. That's extraordinary to have to sit through that in class. And then at Monash University, Israelis are being intimidated by Palestinian protesters. Have a look.
And that's what we're doing right now. This man needs to leave immediately. And you people, every time you dare to show your face, you Israeli-loving genocide supporters, we will be here, we will not leave.
It's just terrible to watch. Well, to discuss this and the broader issue, Liberal MP Julian Leeser joins me now. Julian, good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Sharri.
Look, these encampments have been going on at universities now internationally for weeks. It's good to see, finally, some strong words from Harvard.
Absolutely. I mean, you'll remember Harvard lost their president over their failure to properly recognise anti-Semitism, to say it depends on the context. They lost their anti-Semitic advisory council. They are being sued by several students for their failure to take action. But now what we're seeing on American university campuses is university authorities, police, local authorities like the Mayor of New York, taking stronger action than any of our Vice-Chancellors are doing here to prevent these encampments from continuing, because the president of Harvard is right. These encampments are disrupting the right of students to learn, the right of academics to teach on campus, and that's what universities are there for. They're for teaching, for research and for learning. You know, I think, I'm a former university administrator. Our universities are one of the great, or should be, one of the great achievements of this country. And many families, the idea of having their child, particularly if they're the first in family to go to university, is a wonderful thing. So getting into university, having a university experience should be a time of celebration. But we've got a situation on our university campuses where now the participation of Jewish staff and Jewish students is being excluded, and Jewish staff and Jewish students are being harassed and intimidated. And what happened on Sydney University's campus on Friday, where you had loud drumming and you had people who had nothing to do with the university coming on campus, waving jihadi flags, disrupted the ability of all students to learn and teachers to teach. And I can't believe that we are seeing university vice-chancellors like Mark Scott, university chancellors, people like David Gonski and Angus Houston and Julie Bishop and others, just washing their hands of these things. There's no mention in the Chancellor's statement of Jews or anti-Semitism. It's as if they don't count. I think we're at a really low period in anti-Semitism in this country. I've never seen it like this, Sharri. It's why I've been calling for a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on our campuses.
Well, what would a judicial inquiry look like? What would it do? And what would it have the powers to do? Why do you think it would help?
I think a judicial inquiry is really important when there's a major cultural issue in organisations. We've seen judicial inquiries achieve cultural change in the banking sector. We've seen them achieve cultural change in relation to the way in which institutions respond to child sexual abuse. We've seen them doing similar things at the moment into veteran suicide. We've got to a point now where, even before the 7th of October, anti-Semitism was growing on our campuses and university authorities were failing to deal with it. What we're seeing now on campuses since the 7th of October has been an escalation in anti-Semitic activity. We're seeing intimidation and harassment, and what we're seeing is authorities saying, this is just the price that Jewish students have to pay on campus. If we were talking about LGBTI students, or we were talking about Aboriginal students, and people were calling for the annihilation of Aboriginal people or the annihilation of LGBTI people, I cannot believe that universities would be doing the same thing. But there is a blindness when it comes to anti-Semitism, and there is a lack of seriousness with which the authorities are taking this.
Yeah.
And we can't have a country where one group of people are harassed and intimidated on campuses and we say, this is fine. Because ultimately that affects the productivity of the country, it affects the opportunity for all Australians. One of the great things about this country, and one of the reasons I love it so much, is that we've been one of the few places on earth where there's never been any formal discrimination against Jewish people. But seeing what's happening on our campuses now, it makes me fear for this generation and the next generation. We have to put a stop to it now. That's why I think a judicial inquiry which looks at the incidents on campus, the failure of universities to take action, what policies, procedures and laws need to change to get them to take action is the right way forward to deal with these issues. We're not talking one university, we're talking the whole sector.
All of them. No, I agree with you. The way that racism against Jews is tolerated but wouldn't be, for anyone else, it has been so shocking to many Australians. And also the other point that every other group can say what is offensive to them, but somehow, when it comes to the Jewish people, other people can say, actually, that's not anti-Semitic, that's not anti-Semitic, and the power's taken away from Jews to say, no, that is offensive. I want to ask you about the United Nations vote on whether to recognise a Palestinian statehood. This is happening on Friday. We haven't heard a clear answer from the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, just yet. There is pressure on her at the moment not to give recognition. Jewish groups say that this would be rewarding terrorism. What do you think?
Well, let me start with first principles. I support a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine.
I think most reasonable people do.
Most reasonable people do. But the condition of that is that the Palestinian leadership recognises Israel's right to exist. And there are far too many actors in the Palestinian world that do not recognise Israel's right to exist. And what recognising a Palestinian state at this point in time would do is basically to reward the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. I think if you think back to the 6th of October, what Israel was doing was it was making peace with a whole range of its neighbours. The Abraham Accords with the UAE, it's had peace with Egypt and Jordan for decades now.
Yeah.
But what this would do, by the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state today, would be to actually undermine that, would be to say that Australia voting for that would be to say, actually, we stand with terrorists. And all people need to do who want to achieve things at the United Nations is to ramp up your terror activity. That's a terrible thing. I hope the government does the right thing and stands with our democratic ally Israel and does not recognise a Palestinian state until the Palestinians recognise Israel's right to exist. But what we have seen from this government, even before the 7th of October, is complete backsliding when it comes to Israel. They changed Australia's support for Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They continue to vote against Israel and not with our allies, not with our principal ally, the United States, at the United Nations. Penny Wong, when she visited Israel, refused to go to the kibbutzim in the south of Israel to see where the terror attacks had happened. She has a blind spot on these issues. So I'm not holding out hope, but she should do the right thing, which is to continue to say a two-state solution should be the goal, but not until such time as the Palestinians recognise the right of Israel to exist peacefully and securely in its own borders.
Yeah. Julian Leeser, very strong words. Thank you very much for coming on, and I hope your idea for a judicial inquiry gets traction.
Thanks, Sharri.
Now, as I mentioned at the start of the show, the Albanese government is holding an inquiry into right-wing extremism, but they're deliberately excluding Islamic or religiously motivated extremism. Liberal Senator James McGrath tried to expand the terms of reference of the inquiry to include all forms of extremism, but Labor and the Greens voted down his amendment, and he joins me now. Senator James McGrath, welcome. Look, tell us what happened behind the scenes when you tried to get Labor and Greens on board with expanding the Senate inquiry, not just to focus on right-wing extremism.
It was very disappointing, the attitude taken by the Labor Party, the Greens political party, and also Senator David Pocock. To them, it seemed to a bit of a game that they were doing this inquiry to look into right-wing extremism because they were playing party politics. And the view of the coalition and some of the other crossbench was, no, extremism, especially violent extremism, shouldn't sit on any political radar. Violence is violence, and therefore, whether it's left or right, it is something that the Senate should be looking into, along with religious motivated extremism. But what is particularly disappointed is the Greens. They were laughing, they were cheering, they were so happy that this inquiry got up into right-wing extremism at the expense of a broader inquiry. And that says all you need to know about the motivation.
They were laughing, Senator.
They were laughing.
Why?
They were laughing.
What's there to laugh about? That blows my mind.
Because to the Greens political party, this is a game. To the Greens political party, it is all about them versus us. Whereas the rest of us, your viewers, the people who live here in Queensland, we don't like any form of violence or any form of extremism. But to the Greens, and remember, we've got people like Senator Faruqi, we all know about her deleted tweet, in terms of their approach to other certain groups in Australia today.
Yeah, and I showed that Instagram post on air earlier. But so there was no formal reason or justification that Labor gave you for wanting to exclude Islamic extremism and terrorism from this inquiry?
They gave no reason as to why the inquiry should be expanded to include all forms of violent extremism or religious motivated extremism. And what is particularly disappointing is that this motion was after the October 7 massacre, a massacre that saw over 1,200 Israelis and people from Thailand and the Philippines murdered by terrorists. We saw rising anti-Semitism in Australia. And yet the Labor Party, for whatever motivation, and you touched upon it earlier, for whatever motivation, decided not to expand this inquiry. Now, my view is it is the role of the Senate, a Senate elected by the people of Australia to inquire into such matters and to not look at it through the lens of party politics, but to look at such matters as to what's in the best interest of Australia and Australians to keep us all safe.
Exactly, and you'd think the issue of keeping Australians safe would be beyond party politics. Now, this amendment you tried to move in December last year, so it was before the recent attacks that we've seen. But as you say, it was after anti-Semitism had already exploded, after we'd already seen hate preachers, in my view, inciting violence, although there's been no action taken against them. You know, we've heard from ASIO in recent times that what they call religiously motivated extremism, so that's Islamic extremism, they've just renamed it, is the top domestic terror threat. So do you think it's worth, again, trying to move this motion, trying to make this amendment, or is it just too late in the process, seeing as the Senate inquiry is already receiving submissions?
It is something that I will progress with my coalition colleagues and the Senate. We return next week because it is something that I believe that this particular Senate committee, the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, could still look into in terms of making that amendment. Because we live in a society at the moment, and Julian Leeser touched upon it at the moment, where Jewish Australians are scared. So it's not a case of rising anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has risen. Jewish students at the University of Queensland are afraid to walk across the campus by themselves because of the threats that are posed to them by others at that university. This should not be happening in a first world country.
But these threats are to all Australians, you know, what we've seen in the past few weeks. Senator McGrath, I just want to turn to another big story today. Pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca pulled its COVID-19 vaccine. This comes after they had to admit, following a lawsuit, that it can cause a rare but fatal blood clotting problem and platelet count. Senator, in hindsight, do you think the vaccines should have been mandated?
What I think is there should be a full inquiry into what happened throughout COVID. And what we've seen is various state governments do half-baked inquiries. We've got the federal Labor government who are doing another half-baked inquiry, which doesn't look into the role of the states or into the roles of the current government. So yes, there should be a full inquiry that looks into all matters to deal with COVID. Your viewers may not be aware that more Australians have died in aged care homes in the last 8 months from COVID than who died in the first 2 years of the COVID pandemic. So there is still a COVID issue out there, and I want to make sure all former ministers and all current ministers are called before an inquiry to look into the decisions they made.
Yeah, if only the Royal Commission that we were promised would go ahead. Instead, as you say, it's a half-baked effort. All right, Senator James McGrath, thank you very much for your time tonight. Now, coming up, the Prime Minister caught out after falsely claiming his team had spoken to Beijing about that near disastrous incident involving a Chinese fighter jet and one of our helicopters. I'll talk about that with my political panel after the break. Welcome back. Well, it seems there has been no attempt by any Albanese government minister to speak to their Chinese counterpart after the shocking military intimidation of our Navy helicopter. Anthony Albanese didn't reach out to Chinese President Xi Jinping. And remember, he also didn't raise the attack on our Navy divers with him last year either. My colleague Andrew Clennell today revealed that foreign ministers haven't been involved either. This contradicts the comments that the Prime Minister made just yesterday.
We have made very strong representations at every level to China about this incident, which we regard as unprofessional and unacceptable. One of the things that had broken down over a period of time was any dialogue. And that's why we've used all of those avenues of communication to make our position on this incident very clear.
Okay, let's bring in tonight's political panel, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Sky News contributor Sam Crosby. Welcome to you both. Sam, look, there's little more important than defending our military, especially when they're attacked. I mean, our soldiers, our Navy personnel are literally putting their life on the line for all of us. And especially after that debacle last year with the sonar attack, shouldn't Albanese have directly called Xi over this when he knew that the media were going to ask questions?
Look, it's a good question, Sharri, and I sincerely hope that the Prime Minister clears up in the next couple of days exactly what's happened and who's been spoken to at what level of government. I guess there's 2 points that struck me about today's story. The first is that there's sometimes a good reason why you wouldn't want to start at the absolute pinnacle, at the absolute top, from Prime Minister to Premier. You would want to go through a process so that there's somewhere to appeal. So when one level of diplomacy fails, you can then go to the next level and so on and so forth. The second thing that struck me, and look, it's not up to me to give Peter Dutton political advice. It was a particularly worrying thing when I saw the opposition leader breaking a very strong bipartisan commitment of some 30 or 40 years of oppositions to back governments in this instance. I understand and respect that he's a former defence minister himself, so the urge is always going to be there. But it was particularly worrying to have him out there freelancing and saying, well, the Prime Minister should do X and Y and Z. You know, at times like this, you need to speak with one voice. The government of Australia has the only voice in this debate. And it's not up to any opposition leader, Labor, Liberal, whatever, to be getting in there and freelancing with their own views.
Look, I'll get your view on that, Bridget, whether you think it's appropriate that Peter Dutton had his own view on how the Prime Minister should handle this, near collision that would have been terrifying for our Navy personnel who are in that chopper. But I also want to comment on the Prime Minister's language. It wasn't just that he doesn't appear to have called President Xi. It was also the language and the tone when he made public comments about this. He didn't seem genuinely furious like he should have. His comments were very measured, very calm. This is a near collision, a potential attack on our Navy personnel. Why isn't he angrier about it? Bridget McKenzie.
Yeah, thanks, Sharri. Great to be with you. This was a dangerous, it was provocative and aggressive action by China against our ADF. And it was the second such action in less than 6 months. And so it did deserve and does deserve a very, very stringent and strict and strong approach from our Prime Minister. What I was concerned about in those comments, having heard the breaking news today, was the Prime Minister was not unequivocal. He wasn't saying, I'm going to call in the ambassador or I'm going to do this or that. He used a collective we. And that, in my mind, and I'm sure the Australian public's mind, was that a raft of measures were going to be used, that minister to minister conversations were going to be had. The Defence Minister would be talking to his counterpart. The Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, would be speaking to her counterpart. And obviously the ambassador would be hauled in to have very stern words from the Prime Minister. That didn't happen.
But
and I think that is concerning.
What do you think about this, suggestion from Sam that Dutton shouldn't have criticised the PM on foreign policy?
We're talking about aggressive behaviour from China against our ADF. That does deserve a strong response from the Prime Minister. That does a much better response than he's given thus far. And I'm disappointed with the lacklustre efforts from the PM. Our whole system of government relies on a sense of ministerial responsibility. And right now, you are seeing a complete lack of it from the PM down.
All right,
and
Sam?
You can't get much more serious than this.
Sam, what do you think about that?
Look, I think Bridget is absolutely correct. This is incredibly serious, and that's why it is so worrying, and that's why Foreign Affairs has traditionally been sacrosanct for oppositions to back the government. I mean, the last time I think that you had an opposition leader freelance like this, I think would have been Mark Latham, when Australia was going into war in Iraq with then President Bush. I think that was the last time. every opposition, Labor, Liberal, every opposition leader since then has stood shoulder to shoulder with the government in far less perilous times than when our troops are coming under near attack in the South China Sea. Yeah.
But Sam, you've got a Prime Minister that we can't trust. This guy has basically told the Australian public following this incident that they've all got it under control. He's using every diplomatic measure available when the facts absolutely do not point to that. And so in that instance, we're not going to be backing in a guy that is loose with the truth on these matters to the Australian public. That'd be ridiculous.
I'm sorry, Senator. Go through the time frame again. Peter Dutton was out there on day one saying what should happen. And in the case that you're saying that you can't trust the Prime Minister, my goodness, do you really think now is the time in the face of China to be going out there and saying, no, we've got a difference of opinion? Is that really the time that you think is a good idea of doing this? Or do you think you should handle this more soberly, approaching the Prime Minister behind the scenes and saying, here's what we think you've done wrong and here's where I think you should go right, and being a constructive force?
I'll tell you what I reckon. I reckon it's fine to back in.
I hope the Defence Minister and Dutton have had a briefing from the government on this incident.
I think it's fine to back in the Prime Minister on foreign policy and to have a bipartisan position if he has a strong position. But I think what we've seen from Anthony Albanese, particularly in the past year, is that he's shifted Australia's foreign policy. You know, he's put the bilateral relationship with China over strongly defending our sovereignty. On Israel, I mean, don't even get me started on Israel, but the foreign policy was nothing like what it has been under both Labor and the coalition in many previous successive governments. So, I take your point, Sam. Normally there would be bipartisanship on foreign policy, but it's just that foreign policy has shifted so dramatically
Sharri,
under Albanese.
I hate to disagree with you on your own show. It's incredibly rude, I know.
No, it's not. This is free speech. This is what we have a debate for. We are out of time, though, and I'm not going to cut you off because you're disagreeing with me.
That Australia has somehow sold itself out to China. I just can't accept that.
I didn't go that far, but I said the balance of the relationship, it's putting the bilateral relationship above our sovereignty. That is my view. We are out of time, and not because you disagree with me. I love debate, more than happy to have it. We'll have you on again, Sam. And I did want to ask you about cost of living because I know you work with the homeless, but we are literally out of time. After the break, a royal rejection. King Charles snubs Prince Harry. I'll be joined by a top royal expert from London after the break. Welcome back. Well, Prince Harry is in London, but there are reports the King is refusing to meet with his own son. Let's bring in now Daily Mirror royal editor Russell Myers. Russell, surely the King can find time for a cup of tea or a cucumber sandwich with Harry or whatever it is the royals eat?
Well, good evening, Sharri. Well, you might well say that, and I think that's the question on everybody's lips, because the fact that the King hasn't got time to see his own son when he was just 3 miles away from him yesterday speaks volumes, I think. And certainly people on Harry's side at the weekend were telling me that he was making plans to see the King. So whether something has happened in the sort of intervening time where the words have been exchanged, we don't know. But it's certainly a strange series of affairs over the last few days.
I mean, you understand that the King and the royal family would rightly be furious at Harry and Meghan, but the King has cancer. This is his son. Surely, you don't refuse to see your own flesh and blood.
Well, certainly the mood music from Buckingham Palace has been quite different from Harry's side. For Harry's part, he was saying that, making time to see his father, he wanted to come over to the UK, not only to celebrate the Invictus Games, but to try and see his dad, who's been suffering from cancer. And it's been a pretty tumultuous time for the royal family, and one may wonder why the King has got too much in his diary to just see his son. They only managed 30 minutes back in February, and the fact that he can't even spare a few minutes to see him, I think speaks volumes at this time.
Do you think it'll turn public sentiment away from the royal family?
Well, I think, Harry has had a lot of things to say about the royal family, and there's certainly been a lot of support for Charles and the rest of the royals after Harry's book came out last year. And, nobody was spared Harry's barbs at that time, and it certainly didn't curry favour with the rest of the public. But, this does seem a little petty, doesn't it? The fact that the King can't spare any time to see him when his son is just a mere couple of miles down the road for just a short space of time.
Yeah, and doesn't even have Meghan with him. Russell Myers, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for your company. I'll see you at 8 tomorrow. Here's Paul Murray.